At the annual Chen family Thanksgiving dinner, my sister Jessica stood up with her wine glass raised, her perfectly manicured fingers catching the dining room light. "Here's to Emma," she announced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Our family's eternal optimist who still believes playing with colored pencils and computer screens will somehow pay the bills." The room fell silent as she continued. "Some of us build real careers while others just, well, fail gracefully." Then the doorbell rang, and Marcus Rodriguez walked into our suburban Denver home, his confident stride and knowing smile immediately, shifting the atmosphere. "Emma," he said warmly, "sorry I'm late. The contracts from Netflix, Adobe, and Patagonia took longer to finalize than expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The fluorescent kitchen light cast harsh shadows across my laptop screen as I sat hunched over my makeshift desk at 3 a.m, the familiar weight of failure pressing down on my shoulders like a winter coat I couldn't take off. Emma, Chen, 29 years old, still living in the converted garage behind my parents' house, still hearing the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, still watching my older sister Jessica collect achievements like trophies while I collected rejection emails. My graphic design portfolio glowed on the monitor, each project a small rebellion against the practical path my family had mapped out for me. While Jessica had marched triumphantly through law school, bar exams, and corporate promotions, I had stumbled through art school, freelance gigs, and what my father diplomatically called creative phases. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on Jessica, who had perfected the art of supportive condescension over family dinners for the past 7 years. The garage studio I called home reflected my precarious existence between ambition and reality. Canvases leaned against concrete walls, their surfaces capturing fragments of dreams I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Design books formed unstable towers beside my bed, their pages marked with sticky notes and coffee stains from late-night inspiration sessions that felt increasingly desperate. The space heater hummed in the corner, fighting against Colorado's autumn chill, much like I fought against the growing certainty that maybe everyone was right about my impractical choices. Jessica's voice carried through the thin walls from the main house, where she was undoubtedly regaling our parents with stories of her latest courtroom victory or partnership track milestone. Her laughter rang clear and confident, the sound of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in the world she'd built for herself. I envied that certainty, that straight line from goal to achievement, even as I couldn't imagine trading my chaotic creative path for her structured success. My phone buzzed against the cluttered desk, displaying a text from Mom that made my stomach clench. "Family dinner tomorrow night. Jessica has big news to share. Please try to be positive, sweetheart." The message carried the weight of every disappointed conversation we'd had about my future, every gentle suggestion that maybe I should consider something more stable, every comparison to my sister that went unspoken but hung in the air like incense in a temple. Tomorrow would bring another performance of the dutiful younger daughter, another evening of deflecting questions about my romantic life and career prospects, while Jessica basked in the warm glow of parental approval. I had perfected the art of making my failures sound like temporary setbacks, of framing my struggles as character-building experiences rather than evidence of poor judgment. But lately, even I was running out of creative ways to spin my circumstances. The email notification that popped up on my screen should have been just another client inquiry, another potential project that might or might not materialize into actual paid work. Instead, it was from Marcus Rodriguez, a name I'd seen attached to several successful tech startups but had never expected to appear in my inbox. His message was brief and intriguing, requesting a meeting to discuss what he called an unusual proposition that might interest someone with your particular combination of design sensibility and entrepreneurial spirit. I stared at the email for several minutes, rereading it to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Marcus Rodriguez didn't know me personally, but his research had led him to my portfolio, specifically to a series of sustainable packaging designs I'd created as a passion project. According to his message, he'd been following my work for months, impressed not just by the aesthetic quality, but by the innovative approach to environmental consciousness that major brands were struggling to achieve. The meeting he proposed would take place the following week, but something in his tone suggested urgency, an opportunity that wouldn't wait indefinitely. I found myself crafting and deleting responses, unsure how to strike the right balance between enthusiasm and professionalism. This felt different from the usual client inquiries, more significant somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was simply the relief of being sought out rather than constantly seeking, of having someone recognize value in work I'd created from genuine passion rather than commercial necessity. That night, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where I stood before my family explaining accomplishments that felt both real and impossible. In these visions, Jessica's confident smirk faltered as I described projects that mattered, partnerships that meant something beyond quarterly earnings. I woke with the strange sensation of having experienced a future I couldn't quite grasp, leaving me unsettled and oddly hopeful as I prepared for another day of navigating the gap between who I was and who my family thought I should become. The Chen family dining room had witnessed countless celebrations of Jessica's achievements over the years, each milestone marked by my parents' beaming pride and my own carefully constructed enthusiasm. The wall behind the table displayed framed photographs spanning 2 decades, a visual timeline of academic awards, graduation ceremonies, and professional recognition that served as both decoration and reminder of what success looked like in our household. Dad had spent the afternoon preparing what he called his celebration feast, the same combination of dishes he'd made for Jessica's law school acceptance, bar exam passage, and first job offer. The familiar aromas of roasted duck and steamed vegetables filled the air, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made my stomach churn with familiar anxiety. Mom set the table with the good china, the pieces we only used for special occasions, their delicate patterns catching the light from the chandelier Dad had installed when Jessica made partner track. I arrived at the main house 15 minutes before the appointed time, hoping to settle into the evening's rhythm before Jessica appeared with whatever announcement would dominate our conversation. My parents greeted me with the kind of warm, but slightly worried affection they'd perfected over the years, the love of people who wanted desperately to be proud of both their daughters, but weren't sure how to celebrate achievements they didn't fully understand. "Emma, sweetheart, you look tired," Mom observed, adjusting my collar with maternal precision. "Are you eating enough? You know you're always welcome to join us for dinner during the week. There's no need to isolate yourself in that garage." Her concern was genuine, but it carried the familiar undertone of someone who viewed my living situation as a temporary arrangement that had gone on far too long. Dad emerged from the kitchen wearing the apron Jessica had given him for Father's Day, emblazoned with "World's Best Dad" in cheerful letters that somehow felt like an accusation when directed at me. His smile was warm but cautious, the expression of someone who'd learned to navigate carefully around topics that might lead to uncomfortable conversations about my future plans or lack thereof. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Your sister should be here any moment," he announced, checking his watch with the precision of someone who appreciated punctuality. "She's bringing Brad, of course. He's such a solid young man, so focused and ambitious. You could learn something from..." He caught himself before completing the comparison, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Jessica's arrival was heralded by the distinctive sound of her BMW pulling into the driveway, followed by the careful clicking of high heels on the front walk. She entered with her usual combination of warmth and authority, embracing each parent with practiced affection while maintaining the polished appearance that never seemed to require effort. Brad followed behind her, his investment banker smile already activated for family interaction. The early conversation flowed along familiar channels, updates on work and mutual acquaintances, gentle inquiries about my own activities that I deflected. With vague references to ongoing projects and potential opportunities, I had become expert at making my life sound fuller than it was, at creating the impression of forward momentum without providing details that might invite closer scrutiny. Jessica's big announcement, when it finally came, surprised no one, but still managed to fill the room with fresh energy. Her promotion to senior partner had been expected, but hearing it officially confirmed transformed our dining room into a celebration space where success felt tangible and achievable, if only one followed the right formula. "It means more responsibility, of course," Jessica explained with the kind of false modesty that barely concealed genuine pride. "Managing larger cases, mentoring junior associates, representing the firm at industry conferences. Brad thinks I should consider writing a book about corporate litigation strategies, don't you, honey?" She squeezed his hand with the confidence of someone whose life plans always materialized exactly as envisioned. The toast that followed felt like a ritual I'd participated in countless times before, raising my glass to achievements that highlighted everything I hadn't accomplished. But tonight felt different somehow, weighted with an anticipation I couldn't name. Perhaps it was the memory of Marcus Rodriguez's email, the possibility that my own announcement might one day merit the good. China and parental beaming. That's when Jessica rose with her wine glass, her smile taking on the particular quality it assumed when she prepared to deliver what she considered helpful observations about my life choices. The chandelier light caught her engagement ring, sending small rainbows across the tablecloth as she prepared to speak words I'd heard variations of many times before, but never quite so directly. "You know, Emma," she began, her voice carrying the warm tone she used for difficult clients, "I've been thinking about our different paths lately. It's interesting how some people build their careers step by step, while others seem to drift from one creative project to another." She paused for effect, ensuring she had everyone's attention before delivering her assessment with surgical precision. The words that followed hit with the accumulated weight of years of subtle criticism. Finally given voice. Failure wasn't a word my sister typically used directly, but tonight she seemed determined to speak what she saw as uncomfortable truths about my unwillingness to embrace practical reality. Her speech felt rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing this intervention for months, waiting for the right moment to deliver it in front of our parents where it would carry maximum impact. But just as the silence that followed her pronouncement threatened to crush what remained of my dignity, the doorbell rang with perfect timing. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, offering an unexpected intermission in what felt like the final act of my credibility within the family narrative. Dad's confused expression as he rose to answer the door mirror my own surprise. We weren't expecting anyone else, and our neighbors rarely visited during dinner hours. The sound of unfamiliar voices in the entryway created a moment of suspense that allowed me to breathe again, to prepare for whatever came next. When Marcus Rodriguez walked into our dining room, his presence immediately shifted the energy in a way I couldn't have anticipated. Tall and confident without being imposing, he carried himself with the kind of easy authority that comes from genuine success rather than performed importance. His eyes found mine immediately, offering a small smile that seemed to acknowledge the delicate situation he'd just entered. "Emma," he said warmly, extending his hand as if we were old friends rather than strangers who'd exchanged a single email. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was in the neighborhood and thought we might discuss those contracts sooner rather than later. I hope you don't mind the informal approach." His smile encompassed the entire table, polite but unapologetic for disrupting what was clearly a family gathering. The mention of contracts sent a ripple of confusion around the table, visible in my parents' exchanged glances and Jessica's suddenly alert expression. None of them had heard me mention any contracts, which made sense since I hadn't told them about my correspondence with Marcus or the mysterious meeting he'd proposed. "I'm sorry," Dad interjected with characteristic directness. But who exactly are you, and what contracts are you referring to? His protective instincts had activated, the way they did whenever he sensed his daughters might be involved in something beyond his understanding or control. Marcus's laugh was warm and self-deprecating as he realized the situation he'd created. "Marcus Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand to Dad first, then moving around the table to introduce himself to each family member. "I run Rodriguez Ventures, and I've been working with Emma on what might be the most innovative sustainable packaging platform the industry has seen in years." The words hung in the air like a foreign language that everyone was struggling to translate. Sustainable packaging platform sounded impressive but abstract, the kind of business term that might mean everything or nothing depending on the context. I felt my heart racing as Marcus continued speaking, revealing details about my work that I'd never shared with my family. The Netflix partnership alone represents a fundamental shift in how streaming companies approach their physical marketing. Materials, he explained, his enthusiasm genuine and infectious. Emma's designs reduce environmental impact by 70%, while actually enhancing brand recognition. Adobe has already committed to implementing her approach across their entire print division. Jessica's wine glass had stopped halfway, to her lips, frozen by information that didn't align with her understanding of my professional situation. Her perfectly composed expression showed cracks of confusion as Marcus described projects and partnerships that sounded significant in ways she could recognize, even if she didn't fully understand their implications. But it was his next words that transformed the evening completely, turning my sister's judgment into something that would require a fundamental reassessment. "The Patagonia contract was just finalized this afternoon," Marcus announced with satisfaction. "They're implementing Emma's revolutionary approach to sustainable packaging across their entire product line. It's a $20 million deal over 3 years, with Emma retaining creative control and receiving a percentage of the environmental savings they achieve." The figure landed in our dining room like a meteorite, creating a crater of silence that none of us seemed capable of filling. $20 million was a number that belonged to Jessica's world of corporate deals and partnership agreements, not to my realm of freelance design projects and artistic aspirations. Mom's hand flew to her throat in the gesture she made when processing shocking news, while Dad's eyebrows rose to a height I'd never seen them achieve. But it was Jessica's reaction that captured my attention most completely. For the first time, in our shared memory, my older sister appeared genuinely speechless, her carefully constructed confidence evaporating as she struggled to reconcile this new information with the narrative she'd just confidently expressed about my professional failures. Marcus seemed oblivious to the emotional earthquake he'd triggered, continuing to speak with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a project he genuinely believed in. "The environmental impact alone will be extraordinary," he said, pulling out his phone to show charts and projections that meant nothing to my family but looked impressively official. "Emma's approach doesn't just reduce waste, it actually strengthens brand loyalty among environmentally conscious consumers. Early testing shows a 40% increase in positive brand association." The business terminology he used so casually created a bridge between my creative work and the kind of professional success my family understood and respected. Suddenly, my late nights in the garage weren't evidence of aimless dreaming, but indicators of serious dedication to a project with measurable outcomes and industry recognition. "I've been following Emma's work for almost a year," Marcus continued, addressing my parents directly. "Her combination of artistic vision and practical problem-solving is exactly what companies have been searching for but couldn't find through traditional channels. We're not just business partners. We're pioneering an entirely new approach to environmental responsibility in corporate branding." The word partners seemed to resonate particularly strongly with Dad, whose accountant's mind was probably already calculating the financial implications of the deals Marcus had described. Partnership suggested equality, mutual benefit, and professional respect, rather than the employer-employee relationship that might have seemed more likely given my previous track record. Jessica finally found her voice, though it carried none of its usual authority. "I'm sorry, but this is all quite sudden," she said, setting down her wine glass with careful precision. "Emma hasn't mentioned any of this. Are you saying she's been working on these projects while living in our parents' garage?" Her question revealed the cognitive dissonance she was experiencing, the difficulty of reconciling significant professional achievement with what she'd perceived as extended adolescence and avoidance of adult responsibilities. The garage that had symbolized my failure to launch now seemed like evidence of dedication and focus rather than inability to establish independence. Marcus turned to me with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the family dynamics he'd walked into. "Emma is remarkably modest about her achievements," he said diplomatically. "But yes, some of the most innovative work in sustainable design has been happening right here in suburban Denver. Her portfolio caught the attention of our environmental consulting team 6 months ago, and since then, she's been quietly revolutionizing how major brands approach their ecological footprint." The weight of his words settled over our table, like snow, covering the familiar landscape of our family relationships with something clean and transformative. Everything I'd been told about needing to grow up, get real, and abandon impractical dreams suddenly seemed not just wrong, but actively harmful to what had apparently been significant professional development happening outside their awareness. $20 million, Dad repeated quietly, as if testing the reality of the figure. "And Emma negotiated this herself?" The pride in his voice was tentative but unmistakable, the sound of someone revising long-held assumptions in real time. "Emma is an exceptional negotiator," Marcus confirmed. "She insisted on terms that protect both the environmental integrity of the projects and her creative control. Most designers would have accepted whatever was offered, but Emma understood her value and advocated for it effectively. It's one of the reasons I knew she was the right partner for Rodriguez Ventures." Mom reached over to squeeze my hand, her touch conveying a mix of amazement and apology that she managed to communicate without words. Her eyes held the slightly shocked expression of someone discovering that their child had been speaking a foreign language fluently while they'd been worrying about their ability to communicate at all. But it was the change in Jessica's demeanor that marked the evening's true transformation. Her confident smile had evaporated completely, replaced by a complex expression that combined genuine surprise with something that might have been embarrassment. The sister who had just finished explaining my professional failures was now confronted with evidence that my success had not only matched, but potentially exceeded her own. The contracts Marcus had mentioned weren't theoretical future possibilities, but signed agreements with companies whose names carried genuine weight in the business world. Netflix, Adobe, and Patagonia weren't the kind of clients who worked with amateur designers or invested in unproven concepts. Their involvement suggested that my work had been rigorously evaluated and found not just acceptable, but exceptional. "I think," Marcus said gently, seeming to sense the emotional complexity of the moment, "that Emma has been protecting all of you from the pressure and scrutiny that comes with this kind of success. The negotiations have been intense, and she wanted to be certain everything was finalized before sharing the news. It shows remarkable maturity and consideration for family dynamics." His interpretation offered everyone a graceful way to reframe the situation, transforming my apparent secrecy from evidence of shame or uncertainty into proof of thoughtfulness and emotional intelligence. Rather than hiding my failures, I had been shielding my family from the stress of high-stakes business negotiations until I could present them with completed successes. The evening that had begun with my sister's pronouncement about my professional failures was now reshaping itself around a completely different narrative, one where my quiet persistence had yielded results none of them had imagined possible. The garage studio they'd seen as evidence of extended adolescence now appeared as an incubator for innovation that had attracted attention from major corporations. As Marcus began describing the timeline for implementing the various partnerships and the expanded opportunities they were likely to create, I watched my family members absorb this new version of my story with expressions of amazement that gradually gave way to something approaching admiration. The evening had taken a turn none of us could have anticipated, transforming a familiar ritual of celebrating Jessica's achievements into an unexpected revelation about my own path to success. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of being seen by my family not as the creative dreamer who refused to embrace reality, but as someone who had found a way to make dreaming into a practical and profitable profession. The weight of constant disappointment was lifting, replaced by something I'd almost forgotten was possible: the prospect of making them proud on my own terms, rather than by conforming to their expectations. Marcus's presence in our dining room represented more than just business success. It symbolized the validation of choices that had seemed increasingly questionable with each passing year. Everything I'd endured, from the subtle suggestions about finding something more stable to the direct criticism of my life choices, suddenly appeared not as evidence of poor judgment, but as the necessary struggle that preceded breakthrough achievement. The evening was far from over, and I could sense that the conversations to come would reshape not just how my family saw my professional choices, but how we related to each other going forward. For once, I wasn't the sister who needed guidance or correction, but the one whose path had led somewhere unexpected and remarkable. The transformation felt as significant as any $20 million contract, perhaps more so. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation stretched across our dining room like a frozen lake, beautiful but treacherous to navigate. Dad's fork hung suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of roasted duck forgotten as he processed numbers that existed far beyond his modest accountant's comprehension. Mom's hands had moved to her pearls, the ones she wore for special occasions, her fingers working the familiar beads like a rosary of disbelief. But it was Jessica's face that held my attention completely. My sister, who had spent the evening cataloging my failures with surgical precision, now sat with her mouth slightly open, her wine glass tilted at an angle that threatened to spill Merlot across Mom's white tablecloth. The confident smile she'd worn while delivering her assessment of my life had cracked like ice in spring, revealing something underneath I'd never seen before: uncertainty. 20 million, she repeated, the words coming out as a whisper rather than her usual authoritative tone. You're saying that Emma has been working on $20 million contracts while we thought she was just... She gestured vaguely toward the garage, unable to finish the sentence that would have revealed exactly how little faith she'd had in my abilities. Marcus settled into the chair Dad had hastily pulled up for him, his presence somehow making our familiar dining room feel like a boardroom where important decisions were made. Actually, the $20 million is just the Patagonia deal, he clarified with casual precision. When you factor in the Netflix partnership and the Adobe contract, we're looking at closer to $50 million over the next 3 years. And that's assuming we don't expand into the additional markets that are already expressing serious interest. Mom's hand flew to her chest in the gesture she reserved for truly shocking news, like when Mrs. Henderson from down the street had won the lottery, or when Jessica had announced her engagement to Brad. But this was different somehow, more personal, because it challenged everything she thought she knew about her younger daughter's prospects in life. 50 million, Dad repeated slowly, his accountant's mind clearly struggling to place these figures in any context that made sense with the young woman who still brought her laundry to the main house and borrowed money for groceries. And Emma negotiated all of this herself? Emma is one of the most astute business minds I've encountered in 15 years of venture capital, Marcus said, turning to smile at me with genuine warmth. She understood the value of her innovations before anyone else did, including some very smart people at major corporations who initially tried to lowball her. She held firm on her principles and her pricing, which is exactly why Rodriguez Ventures wanted to partner with her rather than simply acquiring her work outright. The word partner seemed to resonate through the room like a bell. Jessica had built her career on partnerships, on being invited into prestigious firms where her name would appear on letterhead and business cards. But here was Marcus Rodriguez, whose name I'd Googled enough times to know appeared on fortune lists and business magazine covers, talking about my role in his ventures as if we were equals. Brad, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally found his voice. "Rodriguez Ventures," he said slowly, recognition dawning in his investment banker's eyes. "You're the Marcus Rodriguez who founded 3 unicorn startups before. 35? The one who sold Ecologistics to Amazon for $2 billion. Marcus inclined his head modestly. "That was a team effort, though I'll admit the exit strategy worked out better than we'd hoped. But honestly, what Emma has developed makes Ecologistics look like a warm-up exercise. She's not just solving current problems she's anticipating, needs that most companies don't even realize they'll have in 5 years." I watched my family absorb this information, each member processing it through their own lens of understanding. Mom kept looking between Marcus and me as if trying to reconcile the successful entrepreneur sitting at her table with the daughter who still slept in the same twin bed she'd had since high school. Dad had pulled out his phone and was clearly Googling Marcus's name, his eyebrows rising higher with each search result. But Jessica remained frozen in place, her lawyer's mind probably racing through implications she hadn't considered possible an hour earlier. The sister she'd just finished lecturing about facing reality had apparently been living in a reality far more ambitious and successful than anything she'd imagined. "I'm curious," Jessica said finally, her voice carefully controlled in the way she probably used during depositions. "How long has this partnership been in development? Because Emma hasn't mentioned any of this to the family." Marcus glanced at me with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the family dynamics he'd walked into. "Emma has been remarkably protective of her process," he said, diplomatically. "When you're developing something truly innovative, there's always a risk that premature exposure could compromise the work. She wanted to be certain everything was solid before involving anyone else in the complexity of high-stakes negotiations." The explanation offered everyone a graceful way to reframe my apparent secrecy. Rather than hiding failures or avoiding grown-up responsibilities, I'd been safeguarding valuable intellectual property and shielding my family from the uncertainty that comes with ambitious ventures. "The garage," Mom said suddenly, pieces clicking together in her mind. "All those late nights we thought you were just staying up playing on the computer. You were actually working." "Some of the most important breakthrough sessions happened at 3 a.m, Marcus confirmed. "Emma has this incredible ability to see connections that others miss, especially when she's working in that flow state that comes with uninterrupted focus. That converted garage of yours has been the birthplace of ideas that are going to reshape how Fortune 500 companies approach environmental responsibility." Dad set down his phone with the expression of wonder. "According to this, Rodriguez Ventures manages over $3 billion in assets. And you're saying Emma is a full partner in this new venture?" "Equal partner," Marcus corrected. "She brings the innovation, I bring the infrastructure and connections. But make no mistake, this is Emma's vision we're implementing. I'm just fortunate enough to help bring it to market." The word equal seemed to hit Jessica particularly hard. Equal partnership with Marcus Rodriguez wasn't just professional success. It was the kind of achievement that redefined someone's entire trajectory. It placed me not just in the same category as Jessica's corporate success, but potentially in a category beyond it. "I don't understand," Jessica said. And for the first time in our lives, she was the one asking me for clarification instead of offering it. "How did you even meet someone like Marcus? How did this whole thing start?" Marcus looked to me expectantly, recognizing that this part of the story belonged to me to tell. The room felt different now, charged with attention that was genuinely curious rather than politely tolerant. My family was finally ready to hear about my work, not as a cute hobby that might someday pay for itself, But as a serious professional endeavor that had yielded results none of them had imagined possible. It started with frustration, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected it to be. I kept seeing companies talk about environmental responsibility while using packaging that was destroying the planet. Beautiful marketing about sustainability, wrapped in materials that would take centuries to decompose. I thought there had to be a better way. Mom leaned forward with interest I'd rarely seen when I discussed my work. But how did you figure out what that better way would be? Trial and error, lots of it. I found myself settling into the story, feeling secure for perhaps the first time in years, talking about my professional choices with my family. I started experimenting with biodegradable compounds that could maintain structural integrity while breaking down safely. The first 100 prototypes were disasters, complete failures that dissolved in humidity or cracked under minimal pressure. But you kept trying, Dad said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Respect, maybe, or recognition of the kind of persistence he'd always valued, but had somehow failed to see in my creative pursuits. I kept trying because I knew it was possible. And because everything I researched told me there was a massive market demand for exactly what I was trying to create. Companies wanted sustainable packaging, but existing options either didn't work properly or cost so much that they couldn't justify the expense to shareholders. Marcus nodded approvingly. Emma's breakthrough was realizing that the solution wasn't just about materials. It was about reimagining the entire relationship between packaging, branding, and environmental impact. She created a system where being environmentally responsible actually enhances brand connection rather than compromising it. Jessica's expression had shifted from shock to something approaching fascination. Can you give us a specific example? I'm trying to understand what makes this different from what's already available. I felt a flutter of excitement as I prepared to explain the work that had consumed my life for the past 2 years. Take Netflix's physical marketing materials, their promotional packages, press kits, all the materials they send to industry professionals and media. Under the traditional model, they were using glossy cardboard, plastic components, synthetic inks that created a beautiful package that would last forever in a landfill. And your solution? Brad asked, his investment banker's interest clearly piqued. I developed a composite material that maintains the premium feel and visual impact they need, but breaks down completely in composting conditions within 90 days. More importantly, the breakdown process actually nourishes soil rather than just disappearing. Their packages literally help gardens grow. Mom's eyes widened with delight. That's beautiful, Emma. It's like the packaging becomes part of the earth again. Exactly. And the cost ended up being 12% lower than their previous materials because the production process is more efficient. So Netflix saves money, reduces their environmental impact, and actually gets a marketing benefit because consumers respond so positively to the innovation. Marcus pulled out his tablet and showed my family photos of the Netflix packages before and after implementation of my design. The difference was remarkable not just in environmental terms, but aesthetically. The new packages had an elegant, organic quality that somehow conveyed luxury and responsibility simultaneously. The consumer testing results were extraordinary, Marcus added. People who received the new packages were 40% more likely to share photos on social media and 60% more likely to express positive feelings about the Netflix brand. Emma didn't just solve an environmental problem, she created a marketing advantage. Dad studied the images with growing amazement. And every package you create does this? Actually helps the environment instead of hurting it? That's the basic principle, I confirmed. But each client needs customized solutions. Adobe's requirements are completely different from Patagonia's, which are different from Netflix's. The challenge is maintaining the environmental benefits while meeting each company's specific branding and functional needs. Which is why the partnerships are so substantial, Marcus explained. Emma isn't just providing a product, she's providing ongoing innovation and customization. These companies are investing in a long-term relationship with someone who can help them stay ahead of evolving environmental standards and consumer expectations. Jessica had been quiet for several minutes, processing information that clearly challenged her understanding of business success and professional development. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its earlier certainty. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I think I've been measuring your success by entirely the wrong standards. This isn't just impressive, it's revolutionary. And I completely missed it happening right under my nose." The admission was so unexpected that for a moment, none of us knew how to respond. Jessica apologizing to me wasn't something that happened in our family dynamic. She was the one who succeeded conventionally and obviously. I was the one who needed guidance and course correction. "You weren't wrong to be concerned," I said gently, recognizing that this moment required grace rather than vindication. From the outside, it probably did look like I was avoiding responsibility and living in denial about practical realities. I couldn't explain what I was working on because I wasn't sure it would work, and I didn't want to disappoint everyone if it failed. Mom reached over and took my hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "Sweetheart, we never would have been disappointed in you for trying something ambitious. We just wanted to make sure you had a plan for taking care of yourself." "But I think," Dad said thoughtfully, "we may have been so focused on traditional markers of security that we couldn't see the kind of innovation Emma was actually pursuing. We kept suggesting she find something stable when she was busy creating something revolutionary." Marcus smiled at the exchange, clearly enjoying watching my family recalibrate their understanding of my professional trajectory. "If it helps, provide context," he said. "Emma's work represents exactly the kind of thinking that drives successful entrepreneurship. She identified a genuine market need, developed an innovative solution, and persisted through the inevitable setbacks until she achieved breakthrough results. Those are the qualities venture capitalists spend years looking for in potential partners." Brad had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation, but now he leaned forward with obvious interest. "From an investment perspective, what kind of growth projections are you looking at? This sustainable packaging market seems like it could expand exponentially as environmental regulations tighten. Conservative estimates suggest a 40% annual growth rate over the next 5 years," Marcus replied. "But Emma's innovations could accelerate that significantly. We're not just riding a trend, we're setting the direction the entire industry will follow." The business discussion that followed felt surreal in our family dining room. Here was my sister, whose success I'd envied for years, asking detailed questions about market positioning and scalability. Dad, who had worried about my financial stability, was discussing revenue projections that exceeded anything he'd earned in his entire career. Mom, who had gently suggested I might enjoy teaching or social work, was enthusiastically describing my innovations to extended family members over text messages. As the evening progressed, I watched my family's perception of me undergo a complete transformation. The concerns that had driven years of gentle intervention and supportive criticism suddenly seemed not just misplaced but counterproductive. They hadn't been protecting me from unrealistic dreams, they'd been unknowingly discouraging exactly the kind of ambitious thinking that had led to genuine success. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said as dinner wound down, his tone suggesting another significant revelation. "Emma's work has caught the attention of several international sustainability organizations. The United Nations Environmental Program wants to feature her innovations in their next global report on climate action, and the European Union is considering adapting her principles for continent-wide packaging standards." Mom gasped audibly. "The United Nations? They know about Emma's work?" "Emma's developing solutions for problems that governments are just beginning to understand," Marcus confirmed. "She's not just ahead of the market, she's ahead of policy. When environmental regulations inevitably tighten, companies that have already adopted her approaches will have massive competitive advantages." Jessica sat back in her chair with an expression of complete amazement. I spent this whole evening explaining to you what real success looks like, and you've been quietly building something that makes my partnership track promotion look like a participation trophy. The comparison was generous and probably inaccurate, but it captured the shift that had occurred over the course of our dinner. Success, we were all realizing, could take forms none of us had anticipated. Jessica's traditional path through law school and corporate advancement was legitimately impressive, but it operated within existing systems rather than creating new ones. Different kinds of success, I said diplomatically, not wanting to diminish Jessica's achievements, even as mine were being celebrated. We both found ways to build careers around things we care about. But you built something entirely new, she insisted. I followed a path that thousands of lawyers follow every year. You created a path that didn't exist before you made it. Marcus nodded approvingly at Jessica's assessment. That's exactly what makes Emma such a valuable partner. She doesn't just solve problems, she redefines them in ways that open up possibilities no one else had considered. As we moved to the living room for coffee and the chocolate cake Mom had prepared to celebrate Jessica's promotion, I reflected on how drastically the evening had departed from its intended script. What was supposed to be another celebration of my sister's conventional success had become an unexpected coming-out party for my unconventional achievements. The cake that Mom cut now felt like it was celebrating both of us, though in ways she hadn't planned when she'd bought the ingredients that morning. The "Congratulations, Jessica" written in blue frosting across the top seemed to include me now, expanding to encompass forms of accomplishment that hadn't been visible when she'd carefully piped the letters the night before. Marcus fit seamlessly into our family dynamic, answering Mom's questions about his own background, discussing local business developments with Dad, and engaging with Brad about market trends with the kind of expertise that made even my brother-in-law's opinions seem less definitive than usual. But it was his attention to me that marked the most significant change in the evening's energy. For years, I'd been the family member who listened while others talked about their professional lives, offering support and encouragement for achievements I'd never match in my own creative endeavors. But now, Marcus was asking for my opinions on industry developments, deferring to my expertise on environmental policy, and including me in conversations about strategic planning as if my input carried equal weight to anyone else's in the room. Emma's perspective on regulatory trends has been invaluable, he told Dad during a discussion about potential government contracts. She understands the intersection of environmental science and consumer psychology in ways that most business strategists miss completely. It gives us a significant advantage in anticipating market shifts. The recognition felt almost intoxicating after years of being treated as someone whose artistic sensibilities were charming but ultimately impractical. I had opinions about business strategy, insights about market development, and predictive capabilities that had proven accurate in ways none of my family had realized. Marcus's presence transformed me from the dreamer sister into a legitimate businesswoman whose judgment carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. As the evening drew to a close and Marcus prepared to leave, he pulled out his phone to show my family his calendar. "Emma and I have meetings scheduled with 3 more Fortune 500 companies next week," he announced, plus a conference call with a coalition of European environmental ministers who want to discuss implementation strategies for continental policy changes. Mom looked at the calendar with the same expression she might have worn if Marcus had shown her photos of me meeting with foreign dignitaries. The meetings had titles and company names she recognized from news reports and business magazines, presented in a context that placed me not as an observer or supplicant, but as a sought-after expert whose innovations were driving significant policy discussions. "I hope you understand," Marcus said to my parents as he shook hands goodbye, "just how remarkable your daughter is. In my 15 years of business development, I've rarely encountered someone who combines technical innovation with strategic thinking as effectively as Emma. You should be extremely proud." After Marcus left, our family sat in the living room with the strange energy that follows significant revelations. The evening that had begun with Jessica's confident assessment of my failures had ended with my parents trying to process information that placed me in a professional category they'd never imagined I could reach. "I can't believe you kept all of this to yourself," Mom said finally, though her tone conveyed wonder rather than reproach. "All those nights we worried about you staying up too late, and you were actually working on projects with companies we see advertised during the Super Bowl." Dad nodded in agreement. "I feel like we owe you an apology, sweetheart. We kept giving you advice about finding stable work when you were building something far more substantial than anything we'd understood was possible." Jessica, who had remained unusually quiet since Marcus's departure, finally spoke up. "I think I need to completely reconsider how I think about success and career development. What you've accomplished, Emma, it's not just impressive from a business standpoint. It's meaningful in ways that my legal work isn't. You're actually making the world better while building a career that surpasses anything I'd imagined was possible." The admission was generous and probably more significant than she realized. Jessica had spent years being the family's example of proper professional development, the standard against which my choices were measured and found wanting. Her acknowledgement that my path had led somewhere not just different but potentially superior represented a fundamental shift in our family's narrative about success and responsibility. As I finally returned to my garage studio that night, the space looked exactly the same as it had that morning but felt completely transformed. The concrete walls and makeshift desk that had seemed like evidence of prolonged adolescence now appeared as the birthplace of innovations that were changing how major corporations approached environmental responsibility. My laptop still glowed, with the same projects I'd been working on at 3 a.m, but now I knew my family understood them as something more than artistic hobbies that might someday pay for themselves. They were the technical foundations of partnerships that had impressed someone like Marcus Rodriguez enough to restructure his entire investment strategy around my vision. The weight of secrecy I'd carried for months was gone, replaced by a lightness I hadn't experienced since college. My family finally saw me not as the dreamer who refused to grow up, but as someone whose dreams had grown into realities that exceeded their most optimistic expectations for any of their children. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Meetings with companies whose names had previously existed only in business magazines and news reports. But tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep feeling like I truly belonged in my own life, confident that the path I'd chosen, despite everyone's warnings, had led to exactly where I needed to be. The week that followed Marcus's unexpected dinner appearance passed like a fever dream where reality kept shifting beneath my feet. Monday morning arrived with a flood of emails that would have seemed fictional just days earlier. Confirmation of meetings with executives whose names I'd only seen in Forbes articles. Legal documents requiring my signature on deals worth more money than my family had collectively earned in their lifetimes, and interview requests from business publications that wanted to understand how someone had developed revolutionary sustainable packaging while working from a converted garage in suburban Denver. My phone rang constantly with calls from Marcus's assistant, scheduling conference calls with environmental policy experts, sustainability consultants, and corporate executives who spoke about market disruption and paradigm shifts as casually as my family discussed weekend dinner plans. Each conversation reinforced the growing realization that my work had implications far beyond anything I'd originally envisioned when I'd started experimenting with biodegradable compounds in my makeshift laboratory. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of my new reality was the change in how my family interacted with me. Mom began knocking before entering my workspace, treating the garage studio with the same reverence she'd shown Dad's home office during tax season. She'd bring me coffee and homemade sandwiches, setting them carefully on my desk without disturbing the technical drawings and material samples that had transformed from mysterious clutter into evidence of serious scientific work. Dad, who had spent years gently suggesting I might enjoy a career in graphic design or marketing, now checked financial news websites for stories about sustainable packaging innovations and environmental technology stocks. He'd forward articles with subject lines like, "Thought you'd find this interesting," and began conversations with phrases like, "I was reading about your industry," that indicated a fundamental shift in how he viewed my professional activities. Jessica's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The sister who had built her career on being the family's definitive voice on professional matters now approached me with something approaching deference. She'd call during lunch breaks to ask questions about entrepreneurship and business development, seeking advice from someone she'd previously viewed as fundamentally unprepared for adult responsibility. "I keep thinking about what Marcus said," she confided during one of these calls, her voice carrying an uncertainty I'd never heard before. "About how you identified problems that nobody else was solving and created entirely new solutions. In law, we work within existing frameworks, but what you're doing, it's like you're writing the framework itself." These conversations revealed a side of my sister I'd rarely seen: her genuine curiosity about paths that differed from her own carefully planned trajectory. She asked detailed questions about how I'd developed confidence in my innovations, how I'd convinced myself that investing years of work into unproven concepts was worthwhile, and how I'd maintained motivation during periods when success seemed uncertain. "I've been thinking," she said one afternoon, "about whether I've been too focused on achieving within systems other people created. Watching you build something completely original has made me wonder if I've been limiting myself to someone else's definition of success." The admission was generous and probably more significant than she realized. Jessica had spent our entire lives being the family's example of proper professional development, the standard against which every decision was measured. Her willingness to question that path, to consider alternatives she'd previously dismissed as impractical, represented a fundamental shift in how she viewed success and security. But it was during the second week after Marcus's visit that the true scope of my new reality became clear. He'd arranged for me to present my innovations to a coalition of Fortune 500 sustainability officers who met quarterly to share strategies for environmental responsibility. The meeting would take place at a Denver hotel conference center, making it possible for my family to attend if they chose to do so. "You should definitely invite them," Marcus suggested during one of our preparation sessions. "From what I observed at dinner, I think seeing you in a professional context would help them fully understand what you've accomplished. Sometimes families need external validation to recognize abilities they've been too close to see clearly." The invitation felt like a test of some kind, a chance to prove that the evening at my parents' house hadn't been an elaborate performance, but a genuine glimpse into a professional life they'd never imagined I could build. When I called to extend the invitation, Mom's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Of course we'll be there, sweetheart. We wouldn't miss seeing you present your work to such an important audience." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and nervous excitement that suggested she was still adjusting to this new version of her younger daughter's life. The morning of the presentation, I spent extra time selecting my outfit, settling on a navy blue dress and blazer combination that projected professional authority without sacrificing the creativity that was central to my personal brand. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone I was still getting accustomed to recognizing: a successful entrepreneur preparing for a high-stakes business presentation rather than an artist hoping her work might someday support itself. The hotel conference center buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanied gatherings of corporate executives whose decisions affected millions of customers and billions in revenue. As I entered the main ballroom where the presentation would take place, I spotted my family seated in the third row, their faces showing the particular combination of pride and bewilderment that comes from attending events that exceed their previous experience entirely. Marcus introduced me to the audience with the kind of professional warmth that established credibility while maintaining accessibility. Chen represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our industries need to meet evolving environmental challenges, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. Her work demonstrates that environmental responsibility doesn't require compromising quality or increasing costs. It requires reimagining our fundamental approach to material science and consumer experience. As I stepped up to the podium, facing an audience of sustainability officers from companies like General Motors, Unilever, and Johnson & Johnson, I felt a calm confidence that surprised me. This was my expertise, my passion, my contribution to solving problems that mattered. The technical knowledge I developed through years of experimentation gave me authority that transcended any insecurity about speaking to such a distinguished audience. Traditional sustainable packaging has failed because it asks consumers to accept compromises, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. Lower quality materials, reduced visual appeal, higher costs. These approaches position environmental responsibility as a sacrifice rather than an enhancement. My innovations eliminate those compromises entirely. The next 30 minutes passed in a flow state where I explained complex material science concepts, demonstrated the practical applications of my designs, and outlined implementation strategies that could transform how major corporations approached packaging across multiple product lines. The audience asked sophisticated questions about scalability, cost analyses, and regulatory compliance that I answered with the kind of detailed knowledge that comes from living and breathing this work for years. During the demonstration portion of my presentation, I showed actual samples of my packaging materials, comparing them to conventional alternatives in terms of durability, aesthetic appeal, and environmental impact. Watching corporate executives pass around pieces of my work, discussing technical specifications and market applications with obvious excitement, felt like vindication of every late night I'd spent perfecting formulations in my garage laboratory. The consumer response data is particularly compelling, I continued, advancing to slides that showed survey results and market testing outcomes. When presented with products using my packaging innovations, consumers report not just satisfaction, but genuine enthusiasm about the brand's environmental commitment. We're seeing increased loyalty, positive social media engagement, and willingness to pay premium prices for products that align with their values. The Q&A session that followed demonstrated the sophistication of my audience's understanding and their genuine interest in implementing my solutions within their own companies. Questions about intellectual property, licensing agreements, and partnership opportunities revealed that several of these organizations were seriously considering major investments in sustainable packaging transformations. Ms. Chen asked, the sustainability officer from a major consumer goods company, what kind of timeline are we looking at for industry-wide adoption of these innovations? And what capacity constraints should we anticipate if multiple organizations want to implement your solution simultaneously? That's exactly why Rodriguez Ventures has been essential to this process, I replied, gesturing toward Marcus in the front row. Scaling these innovations requires significant infrastructure investment and careful coordination to maintain quality while meeting increased demand. We're prepared to support major implementations across multiple industry sectors, but we prioritize partnerships that demonstrate genuine commitment to environmental leadership, rather than just marketing positioning. After the formal presentation concluded, the networking session that followed provided opportunities for more detailed conversations with executives whose companies represented billions in annual revenue. I found myself discussing technical specifications with chemical engineers, debating regulatory strategies with policy experts, and outlining implementation timelines with operations managers who spoke about my innovations as if they were already integral to their long-term business strategies. My family watched these interactions with expressions of amazement that gradually gave way to something approaching awe. Here was their daughter, the one who'd struggled to explain her career path at family gatherings, engaging in sophisticated business discussions with some of the most influential corporate leaders in the country. During a brief break in conversations, Mom approached with tears in her eyes that she tried unsuccessful to conceal. "Emma, honey, Watching you up there explaining your work to all these important people, seeing how they respond to your ideas, I had no idea. I'm so proud. But more than that, I'm sorry we didn't understand what you were building. Dad nodded in agreement, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of emotion. Sweetheart, I owe you an apology. All those times I suggested you might want to consider more traditional career options, I was speaking from ignorance. What you've created here, it's extraordinary. Not just the business success, but the actual impact you're having on how companies think about their environmental responsibilities. Jessica, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout the presentation, finally spoke up. I've been thinking about this constantly since Marcus came to dinner. Watching you today, seeing how these executives respond to your expertise, I realized I've been measuring success by completely wrong standards. What you've accomplished here isn't just impressive from a business perspective, it's meaningful in ways that make my legal career feel almost trivial by comparison. The admission was generous, and probably more significant than she realized, representing a fundamental recalibration of how our family thought about professional achievement and personal worth. Success, we were all beginning to understand, could take forms none of us had anticipated when we'd established our expectations about career paths and life trajectories. As the networking session continued, Marcus rejoined our family group with several business cards and a schedule of follow-up meetings that would keep us busy for weeks. The response has exceeded even my optimistic projections, he said with obvious satisfaction. I count at least 6 companies that want to schedule serious implementation discussions, and 2 that are asking about exclusive licensing agreements for specific market sectors. What does that mean in practical terms? Brad asked, his investment banker's interest clearly piqued by the commercial implications of what we'd witnessed. Marcus smiled with the confidence of someone who'd navigated many successful business developments. It means that Emma's innovations are going to reshape how these companies approach environmental responsibility across multiple product lines. We're looking at implementations that could affect packaging for hundreds of millions of products annually, with environmental benefits that compound significantly over time. As we prepared to leave the conference center, several attendees approached to continue conversations that had begun during the networking session. Their business cards accumulated in my portfolio, each representing potential partnerships that could expand my work's impact far beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. The drive home was quiet, each of us processing the experience through our own lens of understanding. Finally, Dad broke the silence with a question that seemed to summarize what we'd all been thinking. "Emma, how did you know?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "How did you have confidence that this unconventional path would lead somewhere meaningful when everyone around you was suggesting alternatives that seemed more secure?" The question touched something deep, forcing me to articulate feelings I'd never quite put into words. "I think I knew because the work felt necessary," I said slowly, searching for language that could capture something essentially intuitive. Every piece of research I did confirmed that there was this massive gap between what companies said about environmental responsibility and what they actually did. I couldn't ignore the disconnect, and I couldn't accept that it was inevitable. Mom turned to face me from the front passenger seat. "But didn't you ever doubt yourself? When we were all suggesting you might want to consider other options, didn't you wonder if we might be right?" "Constantly," I admitted. There were nights when I almost deleted everything and started over with something more conventional. But every time I seriously considered giving up, I'd read another study about environmental damage or see another example of companies making token gestures while continuing harmful practices. The problems felt too important to abandon just because the solutions required unconventional approaches. Jessica had been quiet for most of the drive, but now she leaned forward with obvious intensity. "That's what I keep coming back to," she said. "You sustained motivation for years without external validation, without anyone confirming that your approach was worthwhile. How did you maintain confidence in your own judgment when everyone around you was implicitly questioning it?" The question forced me to examine assumptions about motivation and validation that I'd never consciously considered. I think maybe I had to learn to trust my own assessment of what was important, regardless of whether other people understood or approved. Not in a rebellious way, but in a way that prioritized solving problems over gaining approval. Dad nodded, thoughtfully. That takes remarkable strength of character. Most people, myself included, tend to seek validation from others before committing to unconventional paths. What you did required a level of self-confidence that I'm not sure I would have managed in similar circumstances. The conversation that continued during the remainder of our drive home felt like a fundamental reordering of our family dynamic. For years, I'd been the member who listened while others discussed their professional achievements and offered advice about practical life decisions. But now my family was seeking to understand choices they'd previously viewed as questionable, recognizing wisdom in approaches they'd failed to appreciate. When we arrived home, Mom immediately began calling extended family members to share news about the presentation, her voice bright with excitement as she described watching me address an audience of corporate executives who treated my innovations as solutions to problems they'd been struggling to solve. Dad had pulled out his laptop and was researching sustainable packaging markets, environmental regulations, and industry trends with the same focused attention he'd once applied to tax preparation. The projected growth rates for this sector are remarkable, he observed, showing me charts and graphs that confirmed what Marcus had told us about market expansion. You didn't just choose an unconventional career path, you chose a growth industry that most traditional advisors hadn't recognized yet. That evening, as we sat in the living room sharing coffee and discussing the day's events, I reflected on how completely my family's understanding of my choices had transformed over just 2 weeks. The concerns that had driven years of gentle intervention and supportive criticism suddenly seemed not just misplaced, but counterproductive. They hadn't been protecting me from unrealistic dreams, they'd been unknowingly discouraging exactly the kind of ambitious thinking that had led to genuine innovation. I've been thinking, Jessica said during a pause in conversation, about how we define success and security. I built my career by following established paths, meeting conventional expectations, and achieving within existing systems. What Emma did required creating her own definition of what was possible and then working to make it reality. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully before continuing. I think I've been so focused on minimizing risk that I haven't considered whether I was also minimizing potential. Watching Emma today made me realize that the most meaningful achievements might require exactly the kind of uncertainty I've spent my career avoiding. Mom reached over to squeeze Jessica's hand with understanding. We all did what we thought was best, sweetheart. We wanted security for both of you, but maybe we were defining security too narrowly. Emma's shown us that sometimes the most secure path is the one you create yourself, even if it looks uncertain from the outside. The reconciliation felt complete without requiring detailed acknowledgments of past misunderstandings or missed opportunities for better support. We were simply a family recalibrating our understanding of success, security, and professional fulfillment, based on evidence that challenged our previous assumptions. As I returned to my garage studio that night, the space felt like a bridge between who I'd been and who I was becoming. Tomorrow would bring new meetings with executives interested in implementing my innovations, policy discussions with environmental organizations, and strategic planning sessions with Marcus about expanding our partnership into international markets. But more importantly, tomorrow would begin with the knowledge that my family finally understood my work not as a hobby that might someday support itself, but as a meaningful contribution to solving problems that mattered globally. Their support wouldn't change the technical details of what I did, but it would eliminate the emotional weight of pursuing ambitious goals while feeling fundamentally misunderstood by the people who mattered most to me. For the first time since I'd started this unconventional journey, I felt completely confident that the path I'd chosen, despite everyone's initial concerns, had led to exactly where I needed to be personally, professionally, and within the context of my family's expectations and dreams for my future. The garage that had once symbolized extended adolescence and avoidance of adult responsibilities now represented the birthplace of innovations that were beginning to influence how major corporations approached their environmental impact. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had changed. I was still Emma, still passionate about solving problems through creative solutions, still working late into the night on projects that excited me. The difference was that now my family understood the significance of that work, and I no longer had to carry the additional burden of justifying my choices to people whose approval I'd always valued above almost everything else. Success, we'd all learned, could take forms none of us had anticipated, and sometimes the most important victories were the ones that required reimagining what winning meant in the first place. The transformation of my relationship with my family in the weeks following the corporate presentation created ripple effects that extended far beyond our immediate circle. Word of my sustainable packaging innovations had spread through Denver's business community with remarkable speed, leading to invitations to speak at environmental conferences, requests for interviews from local media, and inquiries from entrepreneurs who wanted to understand how someone had built a multi-million-dollar partnership while working from a residential garage. The most unexpected development came when Jessica announced she was taking a sabbatical from her law firm to explore opportunities in environmental law and corporate responsibility. Watching you build something meaningful from scratch has made me reconsider whether I'm using my legal expertise in ways that actually matter, she explained during a weekend lunch at our parents' house. I've been thinking about transitioning into environmental compliance and sustainability consulting areas where I could help companies navigate the regulations that will inevitably follow innovations like yours. Her decision to significantly alter her carefully planned career trajectory represented perhaps the most dramatic evidence of how completely my journey had challenged our family's assumptions about professional development and personal fulfillment. Jessica, who had always been our model of conventional success, was now actively seeking ways to align her expertise with purposes that felt more consequential than traditional corporate litigation. I realize I've been defining achievement by other people's standards, she continued, her voice carrying a thoughtfulness I'd rarely heard before. Partnership tracks, billable hours, case victories, they're all meaningful within the legal profession, but they don't necessarily translate to making a positive impact on problems that actually matter. Emma's shown me that sometimes the most important work happens outside established professional frameworks. Dad had thrown himself into understanding sustainable business practices with the intensity he'd once applied to mastering tax code revisions. He'd subscribed to environmental business publications, attended webinars about green technology investments, and began networking with local entrepreneurs who were developing innovations in related fields. His accounting background provided him with analytical tools for evaluating the financial implications of environmental initiatives, skills that proved surprisingly relevant to companies seeking to quantify the economic benefits of sustainable practices. Your father has become something of an expert on environmental impact accounting, Mom observed with amusement, as Dad showed me spreadsheets he'd created to model the long-term cost savings associated with various sustainable packaging implementations. He's been helping several small businesses in the area evaluate whether they can afford to transition to more environmentally responsible practices. The garage studio that had long been a source of family concern had been transformed into what Mom now referred to as Emma's laboratory, a space she treated with the same respect she'd shown Dad's professional home office. She'd installed better lighting, brought in a small refrigerator for material samples that required temperature control, and created a comfortable seating area where Marcus and I could conduct meetings without being interrupted by household activities. But perhaps the most significant change was in how my family talked about me to friends, neighbors, and extended relatives. Where once I'd been described apologetically as someone who was still figuring things out or pursuing creative interests, I was now introduced as an environmental technology entrepreneur whose innovations were being implemented by major corporations. The pride in their voices when they shared news about my business partnerships was audible and infectious, creating a positive feedback loop that reinforced my own confidence in the path I'd chosen. Marcus had arranged for us to attend a major sustainability conference in San Francisco, where I would be presenting as part of a panel on revolutionary approaches to environmental responsibility in consumer goods. The invitation represented recognition within the broader environmental technology community, validation that my work was being taken seriously by experts who understood its technical and commercial implications. This is exactly the kind of platform that can accelerate industry-wide adoption of your innovations, Marcus explained as we prepared for the trip. The audience will include sustainability officers from companies we haven't yet approached, policy experts who influence environmental regulations, and venture capitalists who specialize in funding green technology startups. It's an opportunity to establish yourself as a thought leader in sustainable packaging rather than just an innovative designer. The conference was scheduled for a 3-day weekend, and when I mentioned it during family dinner, Jessica surprised me by asking if she could attend. "I know I'm still learning about this field," she said, "but I think understanding these industry dynamics would be helpful as I transition into environmental law. Plus, I'd love to see you present to a national audience." Her request felt like a gesture of genuine sisterly support rather than curiosity about my professional activities. For years, our interactions around career topics had been characterized by her offering guidance and me accepting it with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Now she was asking to learn from my expertise, seeking exposure to professional contexts where I held authority she respected. Mom insisted on shopping for new professional attire for both Jessica and me, treating the expedition as if we were preparing for state occasions. "My daughters are going to represent our family at a national conference," she declared with fierce pride. "You need to look like the successful professionals you are." Her enthusiasm was infectious and slightly overwhelming, but it reflected a fundamental shift in how she viewed our accomplishments and potential. The flight to San Francisco provided an opportunity for extended conversation with Jessica about career transitions, professional identity, and the relationship between personal values and work choices. "I've been thinking about something you said," she began as our plane climbed above the Colorado Rockies, "about how you knew your work was necessary even when no one else understood its importance. I wonder if I've been so focused on achieving within existing systems that I've never considered whether those systems actually serve the purposes I care about." Her reflections were thoughtful and genuine, revealing a depth of self-examination I hadn't realized she was capable of. "In law school, they teach you to work within established precedents and proven strategies," she continued. "But watching you create something entirely new has made me wonder whether some of the most important legal work might require departing from conventional approaches, just like you did with sustainable packaging." The conference itself exceeded even Marcus's optimistic predictions in terms of industry response to my presentation. The panel discussion format allowed for extended exploration of technical concepts, policy implications, and implementation challenges that engaged the audience in ways that simple presentations might not have achieved. My fellow panelists included a former EPA administrator, the chief sustainability officer of a major consumer goods company, and a venture capitalist who specialized in environmental technology investments. Ms. Chen's work represents exactly the kind of systemic thinking we need to address environmental challenges effectively, the former EPA administrator commented during our discussion. Rather than accepting the traditional trade-offs between environmental responsibility and commercial viability, she's redesigned the fundamental relationship between packaging materials and brand experience. This approach points toward solutions that scale rather than compromises that limit impact. The audience questions that followed demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both the technical innovations I'd developed and their broader implications for industry transformation. Representatives from companies I'd never heard of expressed interest in licensing agreements, partnership opportunities, and collaborative research initiatives that could expand my work into new markets and applications. Jessica watched these interactions with obvious fascination, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking questions that revealed her lawyer's analytical approach to evaluating new information. During breaks between sessions, she engaged with other attendees about regulatory frameworks, compliance challenges, and policy developments that intersected with my technical innovations. I had no idea how complex the business ecosystem around environmental innovation was, she confided as we walked between conference sessions. Your work sits at the intersection of materials science, consumer psychology, environmental policy, and corporate strategy. It's like you've developed expertise in multiple professional domains simultaneously. The networking sessions yielded connections that would shape the next phase of my business development. Several international companies expressed interest in adapting my innovations for markets outside the United States, presenting opportunities to expand into regions where environmental regulations were either more stringent or evolving more rapidly than domestic policies. A representative from a major European sustainability coalition invited me to present at their annual conference in Brussels, describing my work as precisely the kind of innovative thinking that can help European companies maintain their leadership in environmental responsibility while meeting increasingly sophisticated consumer expectations. By the final day of the conference, both Jessica and I had collected enough business cards and meeting requests to fill our calendars for months. More significantly, I'd established relationships with environmental policy experts who could provide guidance about regulatory trends, sustainability consultants who understood implementation challenges across different industry sectors, and researchers who were developing complementary innovations that could enhance my packaging solutions. The return flight to Denver provided time to process everything we'd experienced and learned. Jessica had filled a notebook with observations about environmental law opportunities, regulatory frameworks that needed updating, and potential career paths that would allow her to contribute meaningfully to sustainability initiatives. "This has been completely transformative," she said as our plane descended toward Denver International Airport. "Not just seeing you in your professional element, though that was incredible, but understanding how many different types of expertise are needed to address environmental challenges effectively. I think I've found a direction that feels both purposeful and practically achievable." Her enthusiasm was infectious and represented a vindication of choices I'd made, despite family concerns about their practicality. Jessica had witnessed firsthand that unconventional career paths could lead to recognition, impact, and financial success that equaled or exceeded what was possible through traditional professional development. The weeks following the San Francisco conference brought a level of business activity that required significant organizational changes. Marcus and I hired additional team members to manage the increased volume of partnership inquiries, implementation, consultations, and research collaborations that resulted from our expanded industry visibility. My garage studio, which had once seemed adequately spacious for individual creative work, could no longer accommodate the meetings, material testing, and collaborative sessions that now characterized my daily schedule. After years of resisting suggestions that I consider more conventional workspace arrangements, I found myself actively seeking commercial space that could support our growing operations. The irony wasn't lost on me that success was compelling me to embrace exactly the kind of professional infrastructure my family had long encouraged me to consider. The difference was that now I was making these choices from a position of strength rather than accommodation, implementing practical solutions to support work that had proven its worth, rather than changing my approach to gain approval. Dad helped me evaluate potential office locations, applying his analytical skills to lease negotiations and space planning with the same precision he'd used for tax preparation. His involvement felt collaborative rather than directive, reflecting our evolved relationship where his expertise supported my vision rather than replacing it with his own preferences. "You know," he said as we toured a converted warehouse space that would eventually become my company's headquarters, "I owe you an apology for all those times I suggested you might want to consider accounting or business administration. I was trying to steer you toward security, But I was defining security too narrowly. What you've built here is far more secure than anything I imagined was possible. The new office space required hiring employees beyond the freelancers and consultants who had supported my work during its garage-based phase. Marcus connected me with a recruiter who specialized in environmental technology startups, leading to a selection process that felt like validation of everything I'd worked toward. Qualified candidates with impressive credentials were competing for opportunities to join a company I'd started with nothing more than frustration about wasteful packaging and determination to develop better alternatives. By the end of the year, my team had grown to include materials, scientists, environmental engineers, business development specialists, and administrative staff who manage the operational complexities of partnerships with major corporations. The company Marcus and I had envisioned during our early conversations had become a reality that exceeded our most optimistic projections. The annual holiday gathering at my parents' house carried special significance that year, representing the first time our entire family would be together since my professional transformation had reached full fruition. Jessica had completed her sabbatical and joined an environmental law firm that specialized in corporate sustainability compliance. Dad had started consulting part-time for small businesses seeking to implement greener practices. Mom had become something of a local celebrity, known throughout their neighborhood as the mother of the innovative entrepreneur, who was helping major companies reduce their environmental impact. "I've been thinking about how much has changed this year," Mom said as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen, where I'd once eaten countless meals while enduring gentle lectures about the importance of practical career planning. "Not just your business success, though that's been wonderful to watch, but how differently we all think about work and purpose and what it means to build a meaningful career." Her observation captured something essential about the year's transformation. My professional achievements had certainly been significant, but the broader impact on our family's understanding of success, security, and fulfillment had been equally important. We'd all learned that conventional wisdom about career development often reflected limitations of imagination rather than practical realities. Jessica arrived for dinner with her fiancé Brad, whose investment banking background now included a specialization in environmental, social, and governance funding. "Emma's success has inspired some interesting developments in my field too," he announced. "ESG investing is becoming mainstream, and companies with genuine environmental innovations are attracting investment at unprecedented levels. What Emma pioneered in sustainable packaging is now being recognized as exactly the kind of innovation that represents both moral imperative and financial opportunity." The conversation that evening flowed naturally between family updates and business developments, no longer requiring careful navigation around topics that might highlight uncomfortable contrasts between different types of professional achievement. We were simply a family of successful professionals who had found ways to align their expertise with purposes they found meaningful. As dinner concluded, and we moved to the living room for coffee and Mom's traditional holiday cookies, Marcus arrived with news that would define the next phase of my professional journey. Several international organizations had collaborated to propose a comprehensive initiative that would establish global standards for sustainable packaging, with my innovations serving as the baseline for new regulations that would eventually affect companies worldwide. The European Union, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and a coalition of Pacific Rim nations have agreed to sponsor a pilot program that would test your packaging solutions across multiple countries and market sectors, he explained, his excitement evident despite his usual professional composure. "If the pilot succeeds, which everyone expects it will, your innovations could become the international gold standard for sustainable packaging. We're talking about global impact that could reshape how billions of products are packaged and distributed." The magnitude of the opportunity was almost overwhelming to contemplate. Work that had begun as personal frustration with wasteful corporate practices had evolved into innovations that could influence environmental policy and business practices on a global scale. The garage experiments that my family had once viewed as evidence of impractical idealism were now being considered as solutions to environmental challenges that affected every nation on Earth. I think, Dad said slowly, processing the implications of what Marcus had described, we need to completely rethink how we understand achievement and impact. What Emma has accomplished here goes far beyond personal professional success. She's created something that could genuinely make the world better for future generations. As the evening progressed and our conversation explored the potential implications of international adoption of my sustainable packaging innovations, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The path from dismissed family, disappointment to globally recognized environmental innovator had been neither straight nor predictable, but it had been authentic to my values and driven by recognition of problems that demanded creative solutions. Jessica, who had once measured success entirely by conventional professional milestones, now spoke enthusiastically about environmental law cases that could protect innovations like mine from corporate resistance and regulatory delays. Her career transition had been motivated by watching me prove that meaningful work was possible outside traditional frameworks, and her legal expertise was now focused on creating systems that supported rather than hindered environmental innovation. Mom and Dad, who had spent years worrying about my financial security and professional prospects, now found themselves planning international travel to attend conferences where I would be presenting to environmental ministers and corporate executives from around the world. Their concerns about my unconventional career path had been entirely supplanted by pride in what that path had achieved. As the evening wound down and family members prepared to return to their respective homes, Marcus and I remained to discuss the logistical implications of the international initiative. The scope of the proposed pilot program would require expanding our operations significantly, establishing partnerships with manufacturing facilities in multiple countries, and developing quality control systems that could maintain the integrity of our innovations across diverse production environments. This represents a fundamental scaling challenge, Marcus observed, pulling out his tablet to show preliminary implementation timelines. We'll need to grow from a successful startup to an international operation while maintaining the innovation capacity that made this opportunity possible. It's exactly the kind of challenge that transforms good companies into industry leaders. The prospect was simultaneously thrilling and daunting, requiring capabilities I'd never tested and responsibilities I'd never imagined accepting. But it also represented the ultimate validation of choices I'd made, despite skepticism from almost everyone who cared about my welfare. The work that had once seemed too ambitious or impractical was now being recognized as exactly what the world needed, and I was being invited to lead its global implementation. As I returned to my apartment that night, no longer the garage studio, but a space that reflected my evolved professional status, I felt a completeness that had been missing during years of family gatherings where my contributions were diminished or dismissed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Marcus and I began planning for an international expansion that would test every skill I'd developed and require capabilities I hadn't yet proven. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of work that had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own, I felt the deep satisfaction of having followed my instincts toward problems that mattered, despite pressure to pursue safer alternatives. The little sister who had been mocked for her failures had become someone whose innovations would influence environmental policy and business practices worldwide, proving that sometimes the most important successes are the ones nobody sees coming until they've already arrived. The transformation was complete not just in terms of business achievement, but in terms of family relationships, professional recognition, and personal confidence. I was no longer defending my choices or hoping they would eventually prove worthwhile. They had proven themselves in ways that exceeded any validation I could have imagined when I'd first decided to pursue sustainable solutions in that converted garage behind my parents' house. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.